Hello guys, welcome to the 9th lecture for Gemini courses series, and in this video we'll talk about version control with our project. Okay, so far we have developed the first version of our application, we have set up the project, we have wrote unit test cases. Now it's time to kind of see like how version control system will work with our project. And the specific thing that I wanted to talk about is like we don't have to remember all those commands and all. We can just instruct Gemini CLI using our natural language prompts to kind of do the work for us. Gemini CLI will write those commands and do all the tracking around our project. Okay, so let's understand what we'll discuss in this video. The first is like why version control matters. We'll do initializing the Git repository. So I'll be using Git and GitHub in this project. If you know any other version control system, you're very welcome to use that. But I'll be using Git and GitHub in this. We'll see like how we can do or check the repository status locally. We'll create a .gitignore file. So basically, we don't want to push all the files to our to the remote repository, right? You can think about it like that. Okay, some of the files like expenses DB that we have created, or some of the packages that we have installed need not be pushed to the other team members that we are working with, right? So that's where gitignore file can come in handy. We'll also make the first commit. We'll ask Gemini CLI to analyze my project and changes I've made so far and kind of generate a good and professional commit message for me. Then we'll see how we can instruct Gemini to view the commit logs, connecting to GitHub, where GitHub is basically where I can push my local changes, and so that the other team members can also see that like what changes are right now on the remote repository. Then also talk about authentication with GitHub, pushing code to remote, hands-on cycle. And the main takeaway is that Gemini Code's SSCLI is not just for writing code for us, but it can also automate these workflows like this version control systems and all those things, right? So yeah, that is there. Now let's understand why version control matters, right? It is essential for saving work in a professional collaborative way, right? Generally what happens is it's not like that only one person will work in a project. Generally in companies or startups, what happens is multiple people kind of works in a project. They need a system where they can collaborate with each other without doing much destruction to the work they are doing, right? So in this way, what happens is that there is a GitHub kind of a thing, or you can push your code to a remote repository, and everyone is kind of syncing or working with that repository. You try to keep that remote repository clean, and basically locally you're working whatever kind of a work you are doing, fine, but make sure your remote repository is clean. Okay. Also think about that, right? What can happen is that maybe you're working and your system just crashed. Your system crashed in a way that, hey, there is no way of retrieving, your hard drive crashed. There is no way of retrieving anything from the hard drive. So in that case, what can happen is if there is a remote repository, if there is a remote place somewhere where your code is secure, where your code is there, then basically it helps in those cases as well, where there is loss of project locally, and then you can retrieve the project from that place. Okay, so it helps in tracking the history, like who has made what change, those kind of things. It enables teamwork, multiple people can collaborate on a project, and also prevents this accidental loss of progress, which you already discussed. Okay, now let's talk about initializing the repository, right? So basically we have a local directory with us, which is called as expense tracker, right? Now what we want to do, we want to basically tell that, hey, we have made lot of significant changes, and we want to initialize Git in this directory. Okay, so we'll use Gemini CLI to run git init. Git init is the command generally you run to initialize the Git repository inside this project. What it will convert your local project folder into a Git repository, saying that, hey, now this directory is under a version control system kind of a thing. It's an important step for tracking the code changes. This is what we said. And this is the prompt that we will give. Please initialize the Git repository in this project. So let me just take this prompt and go to the VS Code where we have been writing code, and I'll give this prompt to Gemini. Let's do this. Okay, so let's see what Gemini does for us. Okay, so Gemini is saying, I'll execute this git init command. I'll say yes, allow once. It wants to execute this git status command, but I'll say not needed now, not needed right now. I'll do it later. Okay, so we have Gemini has initialized empty git repository in this. This is the only thing I wanted to do right now. And let's go, and what are the next steps for us? checking repository status, and that's what Gemini was kind of saying to us, that hey, do you want me to execute this command as well, because the natural thing after doing git init is git status. But let's understand first what this means, what git status means, or what checking the repository status means. We generally run this git status command via git status command to basically see that what changes are being tracked, or what changes are, or what files are being tracked, or what files are not being tracked. Okay, so basically what this command reveals is basically also it kind of at the start it reveals that all these files are kind of right now tracked via git. Okay, but there are many files that we don't want to be pushed to the remote repository. Like for example, the packages that we have installed, like PyTest on all those things. Then Python or any Flask application also maintains a PyCache kind of a folder, which we don't need to push to the remote. Also the expenses DB, right? The locally we are creating many expenses in our project. Why do we want to push that database to the remote repository, right? The other team member can just run some initial scripts to create a database, and he can work on it accordingly, right? So that is something that the git status kind of reveals for us. So let's give the prompt to our Gemini to run for us. Please check the status of our git repository. So let me paste it here. Let's press enter and let's see. Yes, allow once. Okay, so this is what git is saying, that hey, you are on branch main, no commits yet, untracked files. All these files are right now untracked, right? You have just initialized the git repository. Initially no files are being tracked. Which files you want to track, that is something we can do via the stage and the commit cycle. Okay, so let's go back. This is good for us. Let's go back. Now we are going to create a gitignore file. Before we do any commit, or before we create any snapshot of our project using git, we should think about like which files we don't want to put into git, or which files we don't want to be a part of our history, right? So you can basically create a gitignore file. Basically inside this gitignore file, whichever files you specify, inside a gitignore file, whichever files you specify, what happens is git doesn't track those files. That hey, even if I'm making changes to these files, I'm not gonna track all those. Okay? So yeah, so basically what happens is gitignore file has rules to exclude environment specific or temporary files which you don't want to track with GitHub. It keeps a repository clean and professional. Okay, so we are going to create this gitignore file. So let me copy this prompt. Please create a .gitignore file for this project. Git should ignore pycache.dstore and the database file expenses.db that we have created. Okay, so let me copy this. We don't want these files to be part of our tracking. So I'll say paste here. Let's press enter and let's see what Gemini does for us. Yes, allow once. And we have the gitignore file created used from Gemini CLI. Let's see what it has added. It has added all those files which we don't want Gemini CLI or which we don't want basically the Git to track, right? So that is why. Okay, so we can again run this to see the status and see it's really good, right? So gitignore all those files and expenses DB now is not here now anymore. Okay, so Git is saying that hey, you can add those files to for me so that I can start tracking them, and expenses.db or pycache and some other files are also not there. Okay, so let's go back. So this is done. Now we are going to do the first commit, right? So basically commit is basically a snapshot of your project. Hey, so a snapshot basically means till now these are the things that I have been tracking for you, and you can basically kind of see that hey, okay, you have done the Flask setup, you have done what do you call the CRUD code that you have written, all those things. It can be one snapshot, right? So this is how we call it a snapshot. Let's say after doing the CRUD and all, you have saved that snapshot and now you added some more code like authentication and all those things, right? So now what will happen? Let's say your authentication code is now not good. You thought that you wanted to do something, but now the code is not working. The entire project is not working and you have to revert a lot of things, right? Then what you can do, you can just say, hey, I want to go back to the previous snapshot. The previous snapshot was the CRUD code and the setup of the Flask. That's it. And all the authentication code will be removed immediately. This is something that we can do using snapshot and Git and all. Okay. So this snapshot, what it means is we are going to do one snapshot of this, and this is also what we call as a commit in GitHub or Git. We're going to stage all project files. I'm not going to talk about what stage and commit means. We're going to ask Gemini to generate a nice and professional commit message, something like feature, feat, and then colon, and then initial setup of Flask app. This is how in professional companies or MNCs or startups, this is how people generally write a good commit message. Commit the snapshot to create the first version in history, right? This is the first time we are committing something. That means we have created this first time we are creating a snapshot of our project. So this is the prompt that you can use. So let's do a first commit. Please stage all the untracked project files, analyze the state changes, and accordingly create a professional commit message, summarizing the initial setup of application and correct changes, and then commit the changes with the same message. Okay, so let me copy this prompt and paste it here. And let's ask Gemini CLI to make the commit for us. Let's see what commit message it creates for us. So first it want to stage all the untracked files in this project. Yes, allow once. See, very interesting message it has written. Git commit -m feat initial commit of expense tracker application. So it looks good to me. So I'll say yes, allow once. And the commit has been done. The commit message was initial commit of expense tracker application. This looks good to me, right? The initial commit has been successfully created. So this is really good, right? We are not writing any commands, and Gemini CLI is kind of converting my natural language prompts to all those commands. So Gemini CLI is actually writing those commands for me, and I'm just using natural language, which actually feels more intuitive to say, right? Rather than typing those commands and do. Gemini CLI is kind of doing the work for us. Okay, so now the commit is done. What essentially people does is also whenever you commit something, you always try to check the logs that, hey, whether the commit was actually there or not. So for that, the commit log is very important. So either you can run git log to confirm the initial commit is recorded, ensures repository is tracking changes properly, or you can just run this prompt. So let me copy this prompt, show the log of our first commit, and let me paste it here. And Gemini CLI wants to run this git log for us, which is exactly what we wanted to do, right? So let's allow once. And this is the commit. See, this is the commit, and the message is initial commit of expense tracker application. Okay, so this also looks good. Let's go to the next one. Now what we do, we have created one snapshot of a project. Okay. Now all the changes that we have done, all the tracking, all the version control system that setup we have done, all of these are local. Okay. What we want to do is we want to push these changes to something in the remote or something on the network, on the internet. Okay. And this is where the GitHub comes into picture. So what we are going to do, we are going to go to GitHub. We are going to create a new empty repository on GitHub. Then we are going to link this local repository as expense tracker project, inside which we created this inside which we initialized the Git repository, and then basically we made the first snapshot, right? So we want to link this local repo to GitHub using this command, git remote add origin and remote URL. What happens here is basically this URL, right? Everything on the internet is basically a URL. So this repo URL or the GitHub URL for that repository which we have created on the GitHub. Now what we can do, we can say that, hey, locally whatever things are there, I want to push to that repository URL. Okay. So this is something we do by linking the local repository to GitHub using this command. Okay. Gemini can handle this linking automatically if we prompt it properly. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go first to, let's go to GitHub. And let's create a new repository, and we're going to call this expense tracker app. Okay, so no description, fine. We're not going to start with anything. We're going to just create this repository. Okay, and we can just copy this URL, and let's see the prompt that I've written, right? I've created a new fresh repository on GitHub for this project. Please link our local repository to it as the origin. The remote URL is this URL. Okay. So I can copy this prompt. Let me paste it here, and this repo URL, inside this, we can just paste the URL from here, right? This is where we want to push the code. So let me just remove this. The remote URL is this. Let's press enter. And it exactly wanted to run, it wanted to run this command only, which we wanted to run, git remote add origin, this repository URL. Let's allow once. So the local repositories has been linked to the remote origin. I will verify the remote URL now. it wants to run this command, basically verifying the remote origin URL. Okay, yes, allow once, and we can see this, right? The origin is set to this URL. Basically, any changes if we push to the remote or this URL, what will happen is we will see that all the files that we wanted to push will be reflected here. Okay, so now this is done. Let's go back and see this authentication part, right? So GitHub, you cannot this is my repository, right? You can also add that as an origin and you can push those changes there, but you need specific authentication or ability or special ability to push the changes to my repository, whether I'm adding as a collaborator, whether you are in my team or not. All those kinds of things makes sure that not everyone can push to those repositories, right? So this is where authentication comes into picture. GitHub requires authentication before pushing code, and the options are SSH keys, PAT or GHAuth login. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna I think my setup is already done, but you can look into like how to set up this authentication part so that you can push changes from local to your remote repository, right? You create your own repository on GitHub and then you try pushing changes to there. If you see some error, then look at like how I can authenticate to push my local repository to my GitHub repository. Okay, so we will be now, I hope that you have done those things. Now let's push code to remote. We'll use Gemini CLI to push the main branch to GitHub. Local commits are now synced and stored securely when pushed to the cloud. So let me copy this command. Please push the main branch to the remote origin repository on GitHub. So let me copy this command and let me paste it here. Let's enter. Okay, so now the Gemini CLI is telling that the main branch has been successfully pushed to the origin remote. So let me go there and let me go to my repository. This is the repository. Let me refresh here and see. Very beautifully, my changes has been pushed to this remote repository. Right, so this is basically what has happened now. My local changes that I have made or done so far now is completely synced with my remote repository. Okay, so now that is done, let's go back and let's talk about this hands-on cycle. So, right, so what I want you to do is do this cycle or just repeat this cycle, right? So try adding some new features to the project that we have built so far, right? And then what you have to do, you have to try this cycle. Basically, check the status, then stage the changes, then commit those changes and push it to your remote repository. Why is I'm saying this and why I'm giving you this as a homework? Because this workflow forms the backbone of the modern software development that today in MNCs or startups, people do a lot of these things, right? This is basically what they do in their daily 9 to 5 cycle is basically status, stage, commit, push, status, stage, commit, push. Any feature they make, status, stage, commit, push. So this is how it works. Okay. Now let's understand the important thing that we have done here is that initially we generated a lot of code, set up a Flask application, wrote a lot of tests as well. With this, what has happened is with just my natural language prompts, it has converted it to Git commands, right? And we were able to execute all those commands by just pressing enter and by just natural language, by just talking to GitHub Gemini CLI. This makes version control faster, simpler, and more intuitive because running those commands, not every time it gives you a lot of intuition, but saying it out loud and just telling Gemini CLI, hey, do this, do this, do this, it makes more intuitive and it makes much more sense as compared to writing those commands in the terminal. Okay, so that is it for this video. This was a long video, but the main takeaway is that we can run all those Git commands by just talking to these LLMs in plain English. This is the main takeaway that I want you to take. Okay, so that is it for this video, and I'll see you in the next video very soon. Bye.